Good morning. This is Let's Talk New Mexico. I'm your host this morning, Bryce Dix. The Southwest is enduring one of its longest dry spells in over 1,200 years, and 2026 is one of the worst years we've seen yet. Warmer temperatures have prevented crucial snowfall at the headwaters of the Rio Grande and the Colorado River, and what little snow we did get melted quickly under sweltering spring conditions. Now we're feeling the consequences of bone-dry landscapes in the form of strained vegetation, parched streams, sick wildlife, and there's also one particular group that's being hit especially hard. Those are New Mexico's ranchers. In the face of drought, there just is not enough water or forage to sustain livestock, so some are actually reducing their herds to make ends meet. And it's not just the drought. There's also the deadly New World screwworm and a dwindling workforce that threaten the cowboy and cowgirl lifestyle. On this morning's Let's Talk New Mexico, we'll explore these issues and the overall state of ranching, and we want to hear from you, our listener. Do you make your living off livestock? How is drought affecting you? Are you worried about the New World screwworm resurfacing here in the U.S.? How should we balance conservation and a reliable food supply? Send questions or comments to letstalk@kunm.org or call in and we'll take your questions live on the air this morning. The number to call is 505-277-5866. That's 277-KUNM. And just before we get into the content of our conversation, we did have an email before the show that critiqued our promo you just heard that mentions the word cattlemen. Yeah, we acknowledge there are a lot of women in the ranching business. Two are on our show this morning. We just wanted to touch on that. And so now to our discussion. Let's meet our panel. First, I guess we'll start with our Zoom guests. Joining us is Xochitl Torres-Small. She's the executive director of the Quivira Coalition. They are a nonprofit that works at the intersection of conservation and agriculture. They also advocate for something called regenerative agricultural systems. Hey, Xoch.
Hey, Bryce, it's such a joy to join you today.
It's nice to have you. Next up, we're going to just go down the list, is Marshall Wilson. He's the co-director of the Southwest Border Food Protection and Emergency Preparedness Center at New Mexico State University, which I have to point out has a really hilariously long acronym. It's called SWBFPEPC. Thanks for being here, Marshall.
Good morning, Bryce. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And then there's Debbie Hughes. She's the executive director of the New Mexico Association of Conservation Districts, and she's also the co-owner of Hughes Ranch. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
And last but certainly not least, sitting across the desk from me here in the studio is Brian Nowicki. He's the Southwest Deputy Director at the Center for Biological Diversity. He's also a conservation advocate. Nice to see you in studio.
Good morning, everyone.
Appreciate you being here. So now that everyone has been introduced, I just kind of want to set a state of what's going on. I'd like to start with Debbie because she's a rancher. You own a ranch down in the southeastern corner of our state. Can you just lay out what the state of the range looks like given just how dry it's been?
Oh, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, we actually had a really good year last year as far as precipitation in the Guadalupe Mountains. Made a lot of grass. But now our concern is fire danger. So, luckily we do have the tools of using cattle to try to lessen that and hopefully keep it from being a catastrophic fire.
When you say lessen that, do you mean targeted grazing, for example?
Absolutely, targeted grazing. We border a national park in Texas, which is not grazed and has ridiculous amount of fuel. So we have been targeting that pasture and trying to get rid of some of the fuel, lessen the fuel load there in that pasture to hopefully keep from having a fire when we get these dry lightning storms.
So with Quivira, you work closely with ranchers. What are the biggest problems for the, typical, I'm talking maybe mom and pop cattle operation nowadays?
Yeah, what we're hearing from ranchers within our coalition is just the enormous challenges with drought, increasing hot temperatures, exacerbating that lack of precipitation. We have a new agrarian program which supports new ranch hands who are learning from experienced mentors who do regenerative ranching. And one of the challenges that we've seen over the last few seasons is that there's had to be a lot more focus on the basics, on fencing and other maintenance, because there just wasn't the same opportunity opportunity to do some of the other work that's available when there's more forage on the ground. And so finding ways to get new ranchers the experience that they need to do this regenerative management has been a challenge, but it's been all the more needed. What we've heard from ranchers is that when they make their soils more permeable, when they're focusing on roots in the ground long term and that diversity of grasses and forage, their lands are able to better weather the drought that we're experiencing right now.
So we hear a lot about regenerative agriculture. Some people probably don't know what that means. Can you just explain for folks what that is?
It is such a great question because it's not like organic where there's a specific codified definition. It's actually a set of practices that are specific to the areas and conditions on the ground. That does make it harder to quantify, and people use it in lots of different ways. But the basics, and Debbie will attest to this, is really focusing on the health of the soils and what's there. And so there's a few indicators of what that might look like. You look for overall coverage on the ground, so actual coverage. Then you look for the diversity that might be there, roots in the soil that persist year round, and then integrating livestock into that system can be really important. So there's lots of different ways to achieve that, but that's what you're trying to manage for.
Marshall Wilson, I wanted to go to you next. We mentioned at the top of the hour that ranchers are actually reducing their herds right now, even despite a really high price for beef. That's led to a 70-year low in the cattle population. First of all, do you know why this is happening?
Yeah, so it's driven by several different factors, but a large part of it has been discussed by some of the other panelists, the drought and that lack of forage, and that's driven a lot of the reduction in the inventory of the herds, both in New Mexico, but also nationally as well. And so just recognizing that this is a widespread problem, but there are several other driving factors behind that. Markets are part of it, increasing input costs for the ranchers, ranging from fuel to other feed. And so it's important to recognize that there's a lot of different factors going into the reduction in the inventories of cattle. But that means that there are also some opportunities to go along with it. I mean, if you're looking at the numbers of cattle in comparison to overall beef production, there's some interesting things going on, especially at the feedlot and packer level, that kind of points to a resilient overall system for the American rancher.
Well, I mean, with the beef price so high, if I was a rancher, is it really hard to maybe replace a cow if it falls ill or dies from, nutritional deficiency or even, maybe a soil-borne bacterial infection? Is it pretty hard?
Yes, as with any other business, these cows are viewed as production assets. And so anytime you lose any kind of production assets, it hurts the overall bottom line for any kind of business, and specifically for these ranchers, because this is their living, their livelihood, their culture, as everything is tied to the cow. And so losing one of these definitely impacts the bottom line, and it's hard to replace, and for the reasons mentioned.
Yeah. Brian Nowicki with the Center for Biological Diversity. Some people don't know there are millions of cows and other livestock that graze our public lands in addition to people's private ranches. Can you quickly describe how that system works and, how much ranchers pay to participate?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me this morning, for having this discussion. There's two main agencies, federal agencies, that oversee federal public lands in the United States, and most of that is in the western United States. The Bureau of Land Management oversees about 245 million acres across the West. The United States Forest Service oversees about 193 million acres. And in both cases, about half of all that land is open to grazing. One of the things we're going to talk about later is the recent moves by the Trump administration to try to open up the remaining lands that don't already have grazing happening on them.
Vacant allotments, essentially, yes.
They're starting with vacant allotments, which comes out to about 1% of the area of the lands that currently does not have cows grazing on them. We'll talk about that more later, but to get to your question, right now to graze livestock on our public lands, ranchers are paying $1.69 per animal unit month. That $1.69 is for one cow and one calf to be out there for a month grazing on our public lands. And that's about 10% of what they would pay if they had to go onto the open market and use private land feed.
And so how do I apply? It's just a permit system, essentially, to graze my...
In order to get, and you have to have an allotment that you've been able to have a permit for, and then that assigns how many cows can be out there, and then depending on how many you're actually stocking, that's what you're paying.
So we hear this a lot about overgrazing. There's a lot of drought out there right now. There's not enough forage for both native critters and livestock. They're competing with each other. How does overgrazing affect wildlife in particular and land here in the Southwest?
So I'm going to speak very briefly on this because all of our guests have a lot of experience and expertise in this, but I'm here specifically to talk about our public lands. Our public lands, those national lands that belong to all of us and that also are needed as habitat for all of the plants and animals that live in the West, live in New Mexico, and that includes a lot of endangered species that are protected, federally protected under the Endangered Species Act. And just to go back to the original point of this conversation, the drought is making everything harder. All of the places where there is water, where there is grass, where there is forage, those all have greater demand on them. Yes, by livestock, but also by all of the animals and plants that live there already.
Soch Torres Small, this tension between climate change and producers is exactly where Kivera wants to step in. You've told me as such. Can you talk a little bit about how your organization promotes regenerative agriculture, as you were saying?
Kivera Coalition was started in the 90s in the midst of the range wars, where there was a real conflict and continues to be sometimes between ranchers and environmentalists. And the way Kivera stepped in to be a part of the solution was saying, we're going to focus on practices that can unite us, can look at the radical center, which is just recognizing people come from all sorts of perspectives, but where there is a shared ethos of land health, there's an opportunity to work together. And that's where Kivera really thrives. So one of the things Kivera did early on was say, we're not going to get involved in litigation. We're not going to get involved in legislation. Instead, we're going to focus on practices. And that provides a real opportunity to say, what is the impact on the ground and how can we improve that? Everything from working on public lands to restore wetland systems like Comanche Creek and the Forest Service, to working on private lands with our mentors and apprentices. Now, in our apprenticeship program, about over half of the mentors also work on public lands, state lands, or federal, recognizing that crucial connection between the two.
So, Debbie, I kind of wanted to rope you in here because as a rancher, I can see how hard it is to balance all of the demands that come with the day-to-day needs of a ranch, but also be mindful of this damage we're talking about that livestock can potentially do to the ecosystem. There's a lot of that drought. There's overgrazing happening. How do you approach this problem as a rancher yourself?
Well, first of all, I guess I would like to say the term overgrazing is thrown out there a lot when that may or may not be anything that's going on. It's very tied to drought and how much rain you get. But I also want to point out that any of our public land, whether it's BLM or Forest Service, is less desirable land. I also want to point out that those lands, even though they're part of our ranches, come with nothing. You have no water on there. You have no fences. You have to add all that. And for there to be any kind of wildlife on our ranch, we have to provide the water. And I also would say,
can I ask you? You provide the water, meaning through groundwater. How does that work?
Yeah, various different ways. We don't have springs or creeks. We don't have any live water at all on our ranch. And so starting back with the homesteaders where they actually built dirt stock tanks, we have maintained those, kept them built, and we also when we catch water in those from rain, which you have to have your upper watersheds in good condition to do this, but then we also pump that and store that into storage tanks and use that as long as we can. But our wells are 1,500 to 3,000 feet deep. So when we don't have any rain, we're pumping it. But without the ranchers out there pumping the water, we wouldn't have the endangered species or the wildlife.
Yeah, and it's expensive to pump
Very
that groundwater. Alrighty, as they say, time flies when you're having fun. It's about time for a short pause in our conversation. By the way, our phone lines are open. Call 505-277-5866, or you can email us with a question or comment at letstalk@kunm.org to share how you feel about ranching in New Mexico. This is Let's Talk New Mexico on 89.9 KUNM. I'm Bryce Dix, and when we come back, we'll continue our discussion with the notorious New World screwworm. Stay with us. Welcome back to Let's Talk New Mexico. I'm your host today, Bryce Dix. Next week, we'll be discussing Disability Pride Month in New Mexico, so please send any questions you have for that to letstalk@kunm.org. Our focus today, though, is on New Mexico ranching and how livestock are faring amidst historic drought, low forage, and other threats like the New World screwworm. Do you own a ranch here in New Mexico? What are you doing to get water and feed your livestock in the face of severe drought? Or maybe you believe in a complete overhaul of our ag system in the West. What needs to change? Give us a call, 505-277-5866. That's 277-KUNM. We can also be emailed at letstalk@kunm.org. So before the break, we were talking about ranching as it currently stands, but there is a lot of discussion in the news cycle about the New World screwworm and how it could do major damage to America's livestock industry. Marshall Wilson with the Southwest Border Food Protection and Emergency Preparedness Center has his finger on the pulse of this issue. Marshall, can you just really quickly explain what the screwworm is and why it's so feared by ranchers?
Absolutely. Thank you, Bryce. And absolutely. This is a great topic to talk about, especially now with everything that's going on. And so the New World screwworm is actually a pest. It's a fly who lays eggs, and the larvae are actually the concern. The fly itself is not the concern, but the babies of the fly, the larvae, are what cause so much damage. And the unique thing about these larvae are, as opposed to normal screwworms, normal maggots that feed on dead flesh, the New World screwworm only feeds on living flesh. And so that's what makes it unique and so damaging and such a concern to not only the livestock industry, but the wildlife industry, and honestly, any warm-blooded animal is a potential host for a New World screwworm, as they can get into any wound or other open orifice on an animal.
Well, we do see some cases with humans too, correct?
Absolutely, yes. There have been cases in humans. In Mexico, we're seeing cases in humans creep up. We've seen one about a year ago here in the United States that was actually a travel-related case. So they picked it up from somewhere else and came to the United States. But it's any warm-blooded animal, so humans are absolutely susceptible.
So the screwworm was once eradicated from the U.S., right? How did we do that? I mean, we have one case here in New Mexico as of the latest numbers and 40 in Texas. How was it eradicated from the U.S.?
Correct. So we've seen it before. It's not something that's necessarily new to us. And so it was very prevalent during the 60s and 70s when screwworm was the eradication program was really stepped up. And it was eradicated mainly through a tool called the sterilized insect technique. That's where USDA and some really brilliant scientists came up with the idea of irradiating flies, which essentially makes them sterile. And so the unique thing with the screwworm fly is she will only mate once. And so if she mates with a sterile male, then that will mean that the eggs that she goes on and lays will not hatch. And so the sterilized insect technique was the primary tool to eradicate them before, and that's what was used to push them out of the United States down through Mexico and then to a containment zone in South America there at the Darien Gap.
So I guess the next natural question is, why is the worm in Mexico and now creeping up into the U.S.? Do we know why?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And there's a couple different theories. I don't know that we've necessarily pinpointed the exact reason, but some of them link back to our maintenance of the sterilized insect technique and the production environment down there in Panama, and making sure that we're keeping on top of, with nature, things change, and we're making sure that we're breeding the flies that want to breed back to the wild females. So there's some talk that kind of got away, and the males perhaps weren't as vigorous as was needed. But as far as the movement of the screwworm itself, there's some illegal cattle movement down in Mexico, and some of the drug cartels are using them for their purposes. And so there's some theories that that's how it was introduced into Mexico and other South American countries, and has started to move back up into its what was previously its native range.
Okay. Yeah, and it seems like both sides of the political aisle here in the U.S. have blamed each other for the crisis too. I've seen this in some stories by Politico, but for now the federal government is investing in sterilized fly facilities, specifically one in Texas. I wanted to ask you about, what the potential economic impact could be if we had a huge outbreak here in the U.S. Back in the 60s, as you were kind of mentioning, there was huge economic impact, right? Can you kind of lay that out for our listeners?
Yeah, so you pinpointed it. It's really an economic concern, and one of the things we always want to make sure when we're talking about the flies, it's not a food safety concern, but it is a food production concern. And so, from an economic standpoint, trade is a big portion of what goes into that economic consideration. But for the individual ranchers, it's, as we talked about earlier, it's the loss of the animals under their care. And also the wildlife that they're used to seeing on their ranch. And so, the estimates range from hundreds of millions to billions, depending on kind of the outbreak length and complexity. But it's the costs of treating the animals, the potential losses of those production assets themselves, and then things that we're heavily investing in, the new tools like the sterilized fly production facilities,
Right,
or other methods and tools like the drugs, the Dectomax, ivermectins, et cetera, that we're going to need to bring to bear to fight this screwworm back down south.
So before I move on to another desk, you mentioned drug cartels. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Drug cartels trafficking cattle down south?
Yeah, so everything goes back to markets and supply and demand. So we mentioned at the outset, with the historic low inventory of cattle here, and we also talked about the high beef prices. That makes those animals a lot more valuable, and as a potential way to maybe launder some money or move other illicit materials, some of the animals are being used for those purposes.
Okay. Debbie Hughes, co-owner of Hughes Ranch. I wanted to know if you're nervous about the impact of the New World screwworm, especially because you're kind of closer to the border than the rest of us. What do you think?
Well, I think, all ranchers are, concerned, but on the other hand, folks that ranch are tough and resilient, and the families have actually lived through this before. Our family has been on this same ranch for over 100 years.
Oh, wow.
So I know they've lived through the New World or the screwworm at least one time. So we'll manage, and we're really excited that we do have new technology and a lot of new science and folks like Marshall around to help take care of this and monitor it.
So, Soch Torres-Small, executive director of the Quivira Coalition, you guys have told me you are not experts on the New World screwworm, but I just have to ask, what are you hearing, or are you hearing from ranching partners about this new threat to their livelihoods? Have you heard anything?
Sure. I mean, it affects each operation differently. If you're ranching along the border, you're likely working with Mexico a lot in terms of whether it's purchasing cattle or getting genetics or otherwise working with the largest cattle crossing, for example, is in Santa Teresa, New Mexico. And that's been stopped because of the New World screwworm. So we've seen real impacts in terms of that trade that happens along the U.S.-Mexico border. If you're further north, that's going to affect you less. One other contributing factor we've heard about is certainly the change in temperature, and the hotter winters has allowed for more survival of the New World screwworm closer to the border. So I think that's also been a contributing factor for the spread. And if I can just go back, I think it also speaks to Quivira's mission of collaboration across difference. In this case, it's actually between countries. The way the U.S. successfully eradicated New World screwworm in the past was working not just with Mexico, but with other Latin American countries. And so that collaboration is going to be crucial to defeat this in the future, combined with dedication to investment far south of the U.S.-Mexico border to keep that containment zone further down. So as we look towards this, it's just another example of when you work together, you can get more done.
So as I take it, when a New World screwworm case comes up, they dig deep into a cattle or livestock or whatever warm-blooded animal. Then they start festering. Then they drop down into the ground and burrow there, and that's how the spread happens, just for folks who are a little confused on why the spread happens in the first place. Brian Nowicki is in the studio with me from the Center for Biological Diversity. When it comes to wildlife, this is a question that I've had. Are you worried that the fly could maybe spread among endangered species like the Mexican gray wolf is at the border, or even, jaguars, for example?
Thank goodness, as of now, we don't see this as a major threat to any endangered species. But obviously, this is a developing situation, which brings me back to the point that we're talking about now. I don't think we can leave this part of the conversation without acknowledging that under the Department of Government Efficiency, the
Doge.
Elon Musk effort to gut the federal government at the beginning of last year, they cut a bunch of money to USAID, which is exactly for the type of cooperation that Soch was just talking about, the cross-border cooperation with other countries. That included $15 million per year in screwworm monitoring, elimination, and prevention. So that program was cut, and I'm sure they thought it was hilarious that there was a program to pay for bringing flies down to Panama and making them transgender, haha. But it turns out it was really important and is critical to fighting this now. And Trump is now saying that they're preparing to spend $1 billion to combat the screwworm. And we're relying right now on Panama in order to supply those sterile males. All of this is to say that penny wise and pound foolish, they cut a bunch of programs, and now we're going to end up paying $1 billion. Perhaps it could be a much smaller if we'd continued those programs and continued that cooperation, having to start all over. This is going to come back into the conversation later on when we're talking about the plans for what we want to do on our public lands, because in that same first half of 2025, the Bureau of Land Management lost 3,900 staff. The Forest Service lost 5,860 staff that are needed to do the kind of monitoring, to do the kind of work in our forests, on our public lands, that allows for all of this to happen.
Yeah. Back to my original question, though, I'm really interested, and thank you for setting that up. The context is really important. Are you worried about spread within wildlife populations? This is something that I've asked the New Mexico Game and Fish Department, now the new named Department of Wildlife, and they essentially shrugged and said, "We're not too sure yet. We're keeping our eye on it. Is that enough?"
That's exactly right, and that is something that we're going to have to watch. I'm assuming that we're going to be seeing it more in the deer and elk population down along the border before we see it anywhere else en masse. Most of those populations are being monitored, and of course there's a hunting community. We're going to see, as we go into the hunting season, how much it's showing up there and then how much it's spreading.
I think I should wrap in Marshall here on that topic, because wildlife, of course, enjoy much more freedom of movement across the border when compared to humans, right, through ports of entry, and livestock through ports of entry. How is the state monitoring for potential outbreaks of the fly among deer herds, for example, as we heard Brian talking about?
That's a really good question. And so in part of this, I think as we're talking about the wildlife and the livestock, one of the critical things to acknowledge, and we've heard it from some of our old timers who actually fought the fly in the 60s and 70s, is it is important to be out on the landscape and looking at everything, whether it's the ranchers looking at their livestock, whether it's the hunters out there, monitoring the wildlife, or just recreationalists who are out and see something that doesn't quite look right. We absolutely encourage them to report it, whether it's to the Department of Agriculture, the New Mexico Livestock Board, the Department of Wildlife, etc. That's the way we're going to get ahead of this fly, is from folks letting us know where it is, and so we can work with USDA, with our other partners across the board to respond appropriately with things like the sterilized insect technique, the sterilized flies, or if there's other tools that we need to use, any other wormers, ivermectin, etc., we can get out there. For the wildlife specifically, though, we have been working with our partners at the Department of Wildlife and coming up with a plan. And so I know, especially since we had our single detection in New Mexico, they have hit the ground very hard in terms of wildlife monitoring, whether that's with the game wardens, Wildlife Services, a arm of USDA, has put out many camera traps. They're utilizing new technologies such as drones to kind of get out there and monitor wildlife situations. And so I know that's definitely a consideration and something that needs to be thought about. But again, it all goes back to the front line of defense, which is the folks on the grounds, the ranchers, the recreationists, the hunters, and reporting the things that don't quite look right.
Well, ranchers have told me in some of my reports they aren't quite sold on the effectiveness of, like, let's say, trail cameras that you mentioned, or, worm education efforts that you're talking about, because they said it just seems to have minimal impacts, especially among, these hobby rancher communities or maybe communities that just aren't well tapped into a community. What do you say to that skepticism? How are you reaching out to folks and making sure they are, you can do a vaccine schedule for your cattle, for example?
Yeah, so education is a key component. And so as we're talking about the things like reporting, the bottom line is if there's one case of myiasis in an animal, a screwworm fly can lay up to 300 eggs. And thinking about the potential explosion in population, if that case goes unreported, it doesn't just affect you, it affects your neighbors, it affects your neighbors' neighbors. And so it's really important to report it and get a handle of it on it early. As far as the other tools, there are vaccines, there are other methods of control that we did not have back in the 60s and 70s. And we would really encourage folks to speak to their herd veterinarian, their local veterinarian, about what the different options are.
So it's safe to say you're relying on these frontline communities to help curb the spread, right?
Absolutely. Again, it's about the surveillance and knowing where it is.
Right. Debbie, before we go to a break here in 2 minutes, I just wanted to ask you, let's say, God forbid, knock on wood, your ranch was infected with the screwworm. How would that affect your bottom line? I'm curious.
Well, it definitely would affect any rancher's bottom line, because you're going to be not be able to sell any of your livestock. So, but, to keep from having a bigger outbreak, of course, you do want to work immediately with your local Department of Ag, your local Extension Service, all these folks. I mean, they've got teams that have come together to know how to work with the ranchers to hopefully keep it from spreading anywhere else. But yes, it definitely would affect our being able to sell the calves.
Well, and you said your family has had your ranch for over 100 years, right?
Yes,
can you share with us, did maybe your parents or maybe your grandparents experience the screwworm in the 60s?
Yes, sir. It wasn't me, but my mother and father-in-law. I do remember them talking about when they first got married, they were actually staying in a tent to be able to catch the cattle as they came into a forest allotment.
Wow.
And doctor them every day. And I've also heard my husband talking about it. He does remember when the ranchers would call up, I don't know if it was Extension Office or who at the time, USDA, when they found these screwworms. And he said shortly after that, they would be dropping the sterile flies on that location. So, yes, our family does remember it and did experience it.
Well, knock on wood there. This morning, we're talking about ranching, the pros, the cons, and how we can realistically sustain the practice as the West becomes drier. And we definitely want to hear your thoughts or questions. Our phone lines are still open. You can call us at 505-277-5866 to join in on the conversation. This is Let's Talk New Mexico on KUNM. I'm Bryce Dix. We'll be back in just a minute. You're listening to Let's Talk New Mexico on KUNM. I'm Bryce Dix. We're talking about the issues that plague New Mexico's ranching industry and how those problems relate to wildlife, public lands, and taxpayer dollars. We want to hear your thoughts. How do you feel about cattle ranching in the West? Do you have any thoughts on how we can balance the lifestyle with a changing climate? Are you okay with spending public money on livestock drought relief? Let us know. Call 277-KUNM. That's 505-277-5866. You can also email us, if you're shy, at letstalk@kunm.org. And now for the final stretch of our show, the last 20 minutes, I just kind of wanted to delve into what's being done to help ease the strain on ranchers. First to Brian Nowicki with the Center for Biological Diversity. You have been following a new scheme by the Trump administration, specifically the Department of Agriculture. It's called the Grazing Action Plan. It outlines how the government's planning to prop up, in their words, America's struggling cattle industry. Broadly speaking, what would this plan do overall?
It does a lot of things, or at least it proposes to do a lot of things.
Yeah, right.
We don't have a lot of clarity yet. In some pieces, we do have clarity. But let me start off by explaining that public lands in the West supply about 2% of the nation's cattle forage. That is, 2% of the actual grass that they're eating is happening out on public lands. Only about 3% of cattle producers in the United States use public lands. And for the most part, these public lands are used to produce calves that are then sent in their first year to the Midwest or California to a feedlot where they get fattened up and from there get into the food supply. But here, we're not bringing them all the way to market. What I'm focused on, as I mentioned before, is the public lands component of it. And what the Trump administration has most recently in their grazing action plan said that they want to open up more lands to grazing, more public lands to grazing.
What does that mean, though, when you say more public lands? What public lands in particular are we talking about?
That's exactly right. So we already have, as I mentioned, 155 million acres open to grazing on BLM and 75 million on the Forest Service. Within New Mexico, just to name one, they've identified 182,000 acres of potential allotments that are currently vacant that they could have livestock on. They also have other plans to increase the number of livestock generally, which is hard to imagine in a drought and all of the issues that we're talking about today. But just talking about those vacant allotments, they're talking about places that have been closed and have not had permitted cattle on them. Well, that's for very good reasons. Sometimes because there was grazing that was unsustainable there, and they found that it was not meeting the terms of the permit previously. There was endangered species habitat there that was being damaged, that was needed as a reserve for forage when other allotments weren't able to produce enough feed for their cows. So there's all these reasons why these few remaining acres, 182,000, it's not a small amount.
No.
But it's small compared to all of the lands that are open. The reason why those are closed is usually for a very good reason. They're trying to figure out ways to cut corners, to put cows into those areas anyway.
Well, we'll continue talking about the grazing action plan, but I do have a caller on the line, so I want to go to her. Kelsey from Rio Rancho, you're live on Let's Talk New Mexico. What was your question or comment for the panel today?
Hi, thank you. My question was, have you found that bison are resistant to the screwworm? And if so, I kind of see this as an opportunity to maybe do away with cattle and reintroduce bison. And they're much more, they're less intensive grazers, they're better for the environment, and they're native to this area.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering, is that something that's been considered?
Well, I think that might be a question for Marshall Wilson. Marshall, have you thought about how bison may be more resistant to screwworm? Is that a thing that's been talked about?
Not to my knowledge, Bryce. I think generally it's recognized that any warm-blooded animal is susceptible to a screwworm infestation. And so I don't think bison would be any more less prone to getting an infestation than any other animal, but it's an interesting concept and something that I can look into.
Well, and historically, bison were hunted off lands here in the West, historically, for many reasons. Brian, you probably know that up in Montana, bison have been forced off of grazing lands. That is currently happening. There's a rewrite of BLM grazing regulations currently. Do you have any comment maybe on that?
There's been an effort at the highest levels of the Trump administration to show that the administration is responsive to the needs of ranchers. And it's been a lot of diktats that have come out of D.C., out of the Washington office. It is not necessarily relevant to what's happening on the ground in the individual states. In the case you're talking about, yes, they stepped in to say, we want to side with the ranchers that are nearby here and take these bison off of this national grassland to show, yes, we're beating up on these bison, cows are better, but down in New Mexico, Arizona, down in the Southwest, what we're talking about today, there's very much a difference between what the folks in D.C. think can happen and what can physically happen on the ground when you actually talk to the agency that is running these. And that includes, as I mentioned before, the massive amount of staff loss that we've had because of all the firings at the beginning of last year.
Mm-hmm. It sounds like Debbie Hughes, the co-owner of Hughes Ranch, wants to chime in about grazing fees. What did you want to say, Debbie?
Yeah, I just want to make a point that the grazing fees are not the most expensive part of owning a ranch. Each rancher has to actually pay thousands of dollars per AUM to purchase this. And we've experienced this for over 40 years as we purchased shares of the ranch from our different family members, and our sons have done the same thing. So there is a value placed on this grazing, but we also want to remember that the United States provides the safest, most abundant food supply in the world, and that is because of ranchers being out there on the land. And it is part of our culture and our lifestyle, and very, very hard work, but we're happy to continue it.
Well, you're talking about AUM, that's annual units per month. That is a cow-calf pair that is allowed to graze per month. Per month for that AUM, it's really cheap. It's $1.69, I believe, and some change. Is that too expensive, or can you elaborate on that?
Sure. Basically, what I'm trying to tell you is that's misgiving to say that that's the cost, because we paid thousands of dollars to buy this grazing permit from whoever had it before us. So that grazing fee is a very small part of it. And then also the fact that we have to provide all of the water, all of the fencing, all of the care of any type on that land completely without any other assistance. So, it's not cheap. And the BLM lands are the least productive as it is. That's why they are actually cheaper to graze compared to if you were paying for private land grazing.
Okay, Brian Nowicki wants to respond to you.
Yes, and that's all very well taken and all very true. There's a ton of costs and a ton of pressures right now on ranchers. I want to point out that buying a permit from a previous owner is not necessarily money that goes to the federal government. And the High Country News did an excellent breakdown of all the costs a couple of years ago. And they found that the revenues coming in annually, about $21 million, or about $284 million less than what actual market rates would be. And secondly, that when you put everything together, the taxpayer is in the hole about $2.5 billion in federal subsidies at an annual basis, paying for this public lands ranching in the West.
Well, I think you were talking about this investigation by ProPublica and High Country News. We have it linked at KUNM.org. It was an investigation that found government programs supporting grazing on public lands, they do prop up a wealthy few while harming the environment. For example, in their reporting, they found roughly 2/3 of grazing on Bureau of Land Management land is controlled by just 10% of ranchers. Debbie, I just wanted to ask you, do you have any ideas on how we can fix this system? Because you're not a huge producer by any means. You're more mom and pop. What do you think about that reporting? Do you have any ideas on how maybe we can make it more equitable for people to have access?
Yeah, I definitely disagree with some of those figures, because in New Mexico, for example, at least 95% of all of our farmers and ranchers are totally run by family operations. So it's not anybody getting rich off of this. In fact, a lot of years in ranching, you lose a lot of money, or you barely break even because it's such hard work. So programs like we have in the Farm Bill, the conservation programs that we have, those help ranchers to stay on the land. But at the same time, all the work we're doing when we're putting in those practices are helping with soil health, water quality, water quantity, like on and on, total benefits to the citizens of the U.S. And we aren't all sending our beef to the Midwest. There is a lot of local marketing going on. I believe even Marshall's family is involved in selling beef locally.
Soch Torres Small, I wanted to go back to this discussion about the Grazing Action Plan. It's this big policy document from the USDA that is trying to prop up the cattle industry. I know this plan it's really large. There's a lot of text, but what do you make of it? Is there maybe any aspects of it that jump out to you as an answer to what ranchers truly need here in the West?
Well, I'll focus on practice, and then you can extract extrapolate from that the policy that might be recommended. But
Okay.
when, Debbie brought up the really important concept of distinguishing overgrazing from grazing, because we can all see, and many studies have shown the impact of overgrazing in combination with weather and other circumstances. But adaptive or holistic grazing has very different results. We've seen the positive impact on watersheds. We've seen the ecological results of that work. And what we want is the flexibility to implement that adaptive grazing on public lands for the health of the land. There have been arguments made that maybe these new grazing guidelines allow for some of that flexibility. And if you look at, some comments from the Western Landowners Alliance, for example, they've consistently been advocating for increased flexibility while maintaining accountability. And I think that's a pretty fair line. However, it's going to be hard to have that increased accountability if you don't have the workforce on the ground. Yeah. And so when you see the cuts of BLM rangeland managers that fell by 39% from 2019 to 2024, it's going to be really hard to enforce that accountability at the same time as they're reaching the flexibility. And although Kavira hasn't weighed in on policy, we've always closely included federal land managers as part of the solution. That's harder to do when there's fewer of them out there.
Right. There needs to be some insight. That's exactly what I was going to ask you as a follow-up. So thank you for addressing that. I did have another caller on the line, Bean Burr from El Paso. What was your question or comment for the Let's Talk panel?
My comment was, when we dealt with screwworms in the 60s and early 70s, we would see a cow with a sore, and we would go on horseback and bring in that cow and put it in the pen and check the sore, and we were looking for the screwworm larva. And it's probably an inch and a half long was what we would catch. And ranchers would put it in, our agricultural extension agent gave us little vials, and we would catch that larva, that screwworm, and send it into the extension agent. And that's how they got those worms to sterilize them. And it worked a treat, boy. The 70s, the government did a good job taking care of that. So what you're looking for is a cow with a sore. The second comment was, as the lady that has the ranch outside of Guadalupe Peak was talking about the water, the people that don't think cameras will work, if you put cameras up close to where there's water, every animal has to go to water, and they're going to use the same water tanks. The antelope, the deer, the elk, the cows are all watering at the same tanks. If you had some cameras set up to look for any sores, or you're looking for any laceration in the skin so that the worm can get in.
Okay.
If you bring that livestock in, or whatever it is that's got a sore, then you check their sore, and you'd either have to treat it to prevent the screwworm, but if you see any larvae, you collect the larvae. And I think that the cameras would work well.
Okay.
But they need to be around the water source.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for calling in, Bean Burr. I love your name, by the way. Just commenting on our last segment of the show, we talked about the New World screwworm. For now, we're running really low on time, so I just wanted to talk a little bit more about subsidies for ranchers. I wanted to go to Brian again, because conservation groups are very critical about any subsidies that go towards the ranching industry. Conservationists usually say it's a dying industry. I'm not saying that you said that, but that's in general what the vibe is from the conservation community. You told me a couple months ago that the Grazing Action Plan, this big policy document from the USDA, will be able to, or will take away habitat for endangered species. And I just wanted to ask you how so, just so we can kind of like paint a picture of what the consequences could be overall.
Oh, thank you for that question. And to be clear, it is not my position or our Center for Biological Diversity's position that there cannot be livestock out in the West or on public lands. Our position is that cattle should be removed from sensitive habitats, and that's very often the riparian and stream habitats that are also key core habitat for threatened and endangered species. We also believe we should stop taxpayer-funded subsidies in general, and we talked about some of those already. But I think the key thing right now to be thinking about as we're talking about the Grazing Action Plan, as we're talking about these funding cuts, as we're talking about the staff cuts, as we're talking about the introduction of more cows into these vacant allotments, is that unauthorized grazing, trespass cattle going into places where the agencies have acknowledged they should not be, is probably the biggest threat that we can most easily address. They cause substantial damage to those riparian aquatic ecosystems that are the centers of plant and animal life in this arid Southwest. And if we can keep those cows out of where even the agency biologists and the government scientists have said that cannot support and should not be competing endangered wildlife against livestock, that's where we can make the most effort. And that's why the vacant allotments, trying to open them up, is so worrying, because those are exactly in the places where if a cow were to break out of the fences where it's supposed to be, if it starts moving down the stream, it's going exactly into those habitats that are most sensitive.
Xochitl Torres Small, we have about a minute and a half left of the program, but I wanted to ask you about how you feel about where we draw the line for taxpayer assistance as we're talking about this. You're a nonprofit. You provide grants and programs and assistance and resources. Is there a line that needs to be drawn somewhere where it's too much taxpayer assistance or subsidies?
I would ask the question, what are we subsidizing? And this is how we can identify what we want to support, because food is something we all eat, and it's crucial that we have a secure food system. It's also crucial that we are maintaining these lands and supporting them. And so when you look at incentives and subsidies like NRCS subsidies, so Brian was just talking about the impact of cattle overgrazing on riparian stretches. One way to combat that is to get cattle away from those riparian areas by supporting portable livestock watering systems that allow them to take advantage of forage outside of that riparian area. Well, Quivira Coalition is in the process of applying for a grant to do just that, to get water in other areas that help move the cattle and keep that system moving to support the land. So I think there are ways to invest in subsidies that support the rancher and also support riparian health. And I would invite anyone to join us at our Regenerate conference, October 28th to 30th, if you want to hear more about that or other things that Quivira Coalition is doing.
Great. And we have that linked at our website at KUNM.org for the post for this show. I hear the music. That is all the time we have today. I just want to thank everyone who called in and to each of our guests, of course, Xochitl Torres Small, Marshall Wilson, Brian Nowicki, and Debbie Hughes. If you missed part of the show, you can stream it online or subscribe to the podcast with Spotify or Apple. We'll have the audio streaming on this episode's page I just mentioned at KUNM.org shortly. We're also on Facebook at KUNM Radio. If you got lingering questions or thoughts for us, do come back next week when we'll discuss Disability Pride Month. Same time, same place, next Thursday at 9 a.m. Thank you as always to our hardworking team. Our engineers Marino Spencer, Florian Knowles screened your calls today, and Ty Bannerman produced today's show. And I just wanted to give a shout out to Daniel Montano for hosting Morning Edition for me. I'm Bryce Dix. This is Let's Talk New Mexico on 89.9 KUNM. Thank you for joining us this morning.